Hi everyone, in this tutorial I'm going to show you how to paint a tiger's eye in acrylics. Now the first thing I want to mention here is that I am working on a dark panel and my first priority would normally be to map in the darkest outside shape of the eye first. I want to make sure that I've got the shape of the eye accurate before I move on to anything else. However, because I do have a black panel here and I painted this black before I started, there's no point in me doing that because the outside shape of the eye will not be visible. So instead I'm going to be working with the iris colour and the main reflection first and then build up all of the lighter shades around the darkest part of the eye. Now once I've got the fur around the eye in place, that's when I can come back in and work on the darker eyelid. But if you are working on a lighter background, then I would always recommend to start off with mapping in the outside darkest eyelid area first. That gives you a really good starting point and you then know that you've got that accurate. It will resemble that animal if it's right from the very beginning. So from there, what I wanted to then do is start working on the iris. Now as you can see, that first layer looked terrible. That's meant to look that way. The first 2 or 3 layers with acrylics I find don't tend to look the best. You want to keep on layering and trust the process. This is something that I talked about in the real-time version all the way through really, where how the layering process is such an important part of every painting. Now what you can see I'm building up here is the shading on the outside part of the eye. The top shadow at the top and the 2 on the either side are going to help to build up that 3-dimensional sphere shape of the eye. Now regardless of any eye that I'm drawing or painting, this is what I want to get right from the beginning. The sphere shape, the 3-dimensional look is all going to help to capture even more realism in the finished painting. I don't want to put loads of detail in the fur and then get the eye flat and looking 2-dimensional. So this is one of the main priorities when I'm working with any medium. Now once I waited for that second layer to dry, I'm going to come back in and reinforce my contrast and get a little bit more depth and form to the eye itself. Now the wonderful thing about working with acrylics is they do dry fast, but you can also slow that drying time down by applying water to the surface. You can do wet on wet blending techniques. I'm sort of working with a combination of techniques for this painting. I am applying the paint with one brush and then blending it with another brush. If you're working on a larger area, you can use a fine mist spray bottle and apply water to that surface, then apply the paint, or apply the paint first and then apply the water with the fine mist spray bottle. That's going to help to make that paint move across that surface easier and it will slow that drying time down considerably. Now when it came to building up the patterns of the eye, you can see again this is all about a layering process. I'm starting with my darker colours and then I'm building up my highlights from there. Now I personally like to work with smaller brushes. I'm using a mixture at the moment of rounds and filberts, but they're both smaller sizes. I feel that I have a bit more control with the brush and I can be more accurate with my lights and my darks as I'm going, and I feel that that helps for me to follow that reference photo more closely. Now one thing that I really do focus on with any acrylic painting is focus just purely to start with on the values, so your lights and your darks. The colour of this eye, as you can see from the finished painting in the corner, is not right. The colour's going to come in stages, but I want to be focusing on the values, the lights and the darks first, and build up the depth in that area initially. Now the wonderful thing about working with acrylics is because the layers do dry so fast, you can then speed through those layering processes quicker than you can oils. Now here is an example of those glazes. Look at how much colour now is being brought into this iris. It's still not the right colour, but it's far more vibrant than it was a few moments ago. Now the wonderful thing about working with a glaze is, as I've mentioned, it takes out all of the stress about worrying about the colour and then the value, the light or the dark mixture, all at the same time. You can focus on your lights and your darks and then you can really focus on colour separately. You haven't got to do it all at the same time. Now colour selection is something that I'm asked all the time on social media because it's about how do I know which colour to pick, which 2 colours or 3 colours, however it may be, to mix together to get the one colour that I can see in the reference photo. Now because all of my Patreon tutorials are all uploaded now in real time with a voiceover while I'm painting, every decision and explanation is in the moment. So when I'm creating those brush strokes, if I'm moving my brush in a specific way, if I'm mixing my colours, all of that is visible in the real-time versions. I've got a palette camera in the corner so you can see just how much paint I'm using, how I'm loading my brush and so on. So if you would like to paint along to this tutorial or any of my other in-depth acrylic tutorials, then my Patreon is all linked in the description below. Now on Patreon I don't just offer acrylics, I also work with pastels and graphite, and Patreon's there I've got a range of tier options, so if you do like working with multiple mediums or just one single medium on its own, then there are different tier options available. So onto the fur of the study, and the first thing that I want to get in place here is a nice blended base layer. Now if you've seen many of my other videos here on YouTube, you know that I put a lot of emphasis on this first base layer stage. The reason being, I feel this is our foundation for our details, so the first thing I want to get right here is not only that I have it fairly blended to avoid any harsh start and stop points, but I do want to map in the main lights and darks first. So the reason being then I'm able to follow that reference photo more closely. It's already starting to look accurate to that reference photo purely because I've mapped in the main lights and darks. Now the one aspect that every single one of my acrylic tutorials on Patreon covers thoroughly is brush technique. It doesn't matter what brush we're using, the brush technique and how to use that brush is very important. So here, this is a grass comb brush, they also call it a rake brush, and I didn't really like the texture that it was giving me. I did continue to use it just for this first layer because I knew I was going to be painting over it, but I just did want to show my Patreon members exactly how to use that brush if this was their preferred option. Now the reason why the rake brush wasn't my preference here is because I felt that the fur, it had too much sort of symmetry. All the brush strokes started to look the same. Now in terms of the tiger, the fur is a little bit longer, especially over the top of the eye, and that requires a bit more freedom with individual brush strokes. So that's why I switched over to using my liner brushes. But using a liner brush for your details here, it does take a little longer. You do have to paint the individual hairs in, but I feel that that time is worth it. I don't want to be using a rake brush just to speed up that process if I'm going to get fur that looks two-dimensional and flat. And that can happen with a rake brush. So I would always recommend that if you do use a rake brush, you do go over the top with a liner brush to add a different type of brush stroke, because otherwise a rake brush can end up with details that are all in set rows. So you just want to be very aware of that. Now what a rake brush is, and again this is something that I talk about on Patreon, is if you imagine you have a filbert brush in front of you and you then spread the bristles of that brush apart so it's almost like it's damaged, that would be what a rake brush would give you. So for every one brush stroke you create, those individual or separated sections of the bristles would create 4 or 5 individual brush strokes. So it does speed up that process, but because that brush can only be moved in one certain way per individual brush stroke, those 4 or 5 lines it creates are all in a set section. So you can end up with fur, as I've said, that looks very samey and flat. So you do want to be very, very aware of that. But as I've said here, my preference was definitely to switch over to a liner brush. So here I'm mapping in those lights and darks. I'm building up my lighter layers gradually. Now the most important thing with this stage is, as I've mentioned throughout, layers and allowing the darker layers to show through. We don't want to be blocking in so many details here that we cover up all of the dark values. We still do want those to show through. Now when using a liner brush for the details here, getting the mixture paint versus water is really important. If you're using this brush and you're finding that your brush strokes are having start and stop movements, almost like it can't continue the original brush stroke from the beginning to the end, then that's an indication that you've got either too much paint, so the mixture's too thick, or you don't have enough water and you need to thin it down slightly so that paint can leave the brush a little easier. But you do also want to be very aware of how to use these brushes. Like with any brush, the more pressure you apply, the thicker those lines are going to be. I do think a liner brush is one of the brushes where it's worthwhile just to practice, so maybe get a little bit of watercolour paper and just use some black paint and get used to different sorts of brush strokes, the length of the brush strokes that can be varied, the thickness and so on. When you're also using any brush, especially a liner brush, you don't want to use straight lines. So look at how all of my brush strokes are curved. They're following the anatomy, the structure of that eye. Now I have a video here on YouTube, it's my top tips for painting realistic fur in acrylics. I'll link that in the description below if it's of interest. And there I talk about many different things, but one of which is the brush technique. So that's the fur direction, fur length and fur thickness. Now all three of those things here are very important. The fur direction is not random, it follows the underlying bone and muscular structure. So this little eye study is a perfect example of that. The fur on the top of the eye as it curves over, that's following the position of the eye socket, the shape of the skull. All of those things are so important. Now the thickness of those brush strokes, as I've mentioned briefly here, is based on how much pressure you're applying to the brush. The more pressure you apply, the thicker your line is going to be. Now this is why you really don't want to be applying too much pressure, because you're going to end up with fur that looks far too clumpy. So that's something that we just really want to try to avoid and be very aware of. But for some textures, that slightly thicker brush stroke may work. So it is going to depend on the animal and the reference photo that you're working from. Now the last thing there was the length of the fur. So of course this depends on how long that brush stroke is in contact with the surface. For short fur, like in the corner on the left side, the brush would be in contact with that surface for a split second. Whereas these longer details I'm painting now, you want to be maybe 1.5 seconds. It's just going to depend on the length of that fur. So it really is something where you want to study that reference photo, only look at 1 square inch at a time if needed, and just put in the details for that area, wait for it to dry and then move on. I think breaking it up into small chunks and individual layers like that makes it far easier to tackle. Now the one thing that I want to mention here, because this painting is demonstrating it quite well, is that sometimes acrylics are said that they fade when they dry. Now it's not that they're fading. If you're using a light fast colour like I am here, I'm using Liquitex Basics, they are a great paint to use. The paints here, they're not fading, it's just that when they're drying with a matte finish. Now my preference is to apply a gloss varnish over the top, and that makes that painting go back to how it did when the paint was wet. So your darks go really dark, your highlights are nice and bright, but the colour saturation is stunning, and that's why I like to use a gloss varnish. So if you are working in acrylics, it's not that they're fading. If you're using a good brand, it's not that they're fading, it's just that some acrylic paints do dry with that matte finish, and it makes it look temporarily a little bit dull. But don't worry, as soon as you apply your varnish over the top, especially if it is a gloss varnish, then everything goes back to how it did when the painting was wet. So I really hope that the tips and techniques that I've shared in this video have been useful. If they were, I would really appreciate it if you could give the video a like and a thumbs up. It makes a huge difference to my channel. I also upload a couple of videos here to YouTube every week, so if you'd like to get notified of that content, then don't forget to hit the subscribe and the bell button. I'm going to be uploading another video next week, but if you do want to paint along to this real-time version on Patreon or any of my in-depth tutorials, then I'll link that all in the description below. If you do have any art-related questions or questions about Patreon, anything at all, then feel free to pop them in the comments, because I'm more than happy to help if I can. One thing I'll mention about Patreon is it's incredibly flexible, so you can stay for as long as you want or you can cancel at any time. So I've got another video that will be uploaded next week, but as always, thank you so much for watching.